But even if, in some fantasy world or parallel universe, socialism did produce, I would still oppose it, and you should still oppose it, because it is evil. And the reason it is evil is because it infringes upon the rights of the individual.
But of course, if we're interested in a politics of liberty, it's important for every individual to have the confidence and the competence in his or her, increasingly her own judgment, so that they can understand the way the world actually is in order to live successfully in it.
Ayn Rand is making a comeback, and the Atlas Society is making it happen.
All right, we're back. We are going to start off today with a half-hour segment talking about the pandemic. This is titled The Pandemic, Pandemonium. And Matt, I'm going to let you take it away. No, sorry, Mark, I'm going to let you take it away. I was throwing it to our guest before I threw it to my co-host.
Well, we have three guests with us, and and these are all experts who have had lots of experience with the pandemic or the COVID-19 or the Chinese flu that President Trump used the term at last night's debate. I want to start, well, let me first quickly introduce each one of our panelists. We have Lord Matt Ridley from the UK, who's a member of the House of Lords, and so he's coming to us all the way across the pond, and an author and a scientist, and has written extensively on the virus, the coronavirus that we faced and its impact. Then we have Johan Norberg from Sweden, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and an author as well, and his Free to Choose videos we absolutely love. That it's just great. What is it, like a 1 minute, couple of minutes, dispelling a lot of the myths that are out there. Love that. I think everybody would really enjoy that. And then Dr. Joel Mercola, who is one of the world's experts, medical and MD and expert on the COVID-19 and so forth. So we have a great group here. And so I'll ask questions, and Dave will ask questions, and let's have a really good session. So let me start with
Mark.
Matt.
Before we
Yes.
before we get to the first question, I just have to point out that let it never be said that FreedomFest guests are not well read, because there are roughly 1 billion books in that image right there. But these guys.
It's very, very true. They are authors, and don't forget us. We write books too. So Matt, let me ask you this question. Didn't you start off as a super alarmist, warning that millions of people were going to die based on the models that were created? What have you learned since then? Is it as bad as we expected? What have we learned, and have you gone from being an alarmist to a skeptic, or how do you put yourselves in this spectrum dealing with the lockdown and all that sort of thing? Give us your perspective historically, how you have changed your views over time.
Yeah, well, Mark, I'm a bit all over the place, like a lot of us on this. We're changing our minds as we go along. But 10 years ago, I wrote a book called The Rational Optimist, which I said the world's getting better, not worse. And I did say in that one of the things that might go wrong in this century is a pandemic. And I at one point said it might come from bats if we do, because of SARS and MERS and these other ones. But I got pretty reassured about our ability to get ahead of a virus because of genomic skills, because the bird flu, swine flu, SARS failed to mount a major challenge to the human race. And so I entered this year not expecting a serious problem from the Wuhan stories that were coming out. I didn't think it was going to spread to the West. Once it did, though, and I realized it had this very strange combination of being asymptomatic and very mild for a lot of people, but very dangerous for a few, I realized that this was actually a very dangerous combination, and it might be very hard to control it. And I think we've seen that is the case. We don't seem to be able to suppress it with non-pharmaceutical interventions, with lockdowns and things very effectively. We make a hash of that, but we can't get a vaccine ready. We've entered this year without enough innovation in vaccine development and things like that. So it has come along in a peculiarly well-designed way to exploit the vulnerabilities that we have at the moment. But as the time has gone on, I have become convinced that a lot of what we did in the early months was wrong. We effectively directed the virus into hospitals and care homes where it did the most damage. And we didn't allow herd immunity to build up in the general population. And I think we're going to hear from Johan how Sweden did something that was much more sustainable. And I think we all should be learning a lot from what the Swedes have done.
Well, maybe that's a good segue into Johan. Let's get Johan Norberg's views. Johan, you're in Stockholm right now, and can you tell us, there's been a lot of criticism of the Swedish model that it resulted in a high level of deaths compared to Norway and Denmark and Finland and so forth. But now it seems like the Swedish model is getting a lot of positive response, that maybe that was the right way to go. Can you give us your perspective on the Swedish model? You're an outlier. Why? How did you come up with this? It sounds like, is it Turgnell, the primary figure involved here? Does he deserve the Nobel Prize in chemistry?
Well, we'll see, I guess, is the safest answer. Yes, Sweden is an outlier for the peculiar reason that Sweden stuck to the policy that most public health authorities actually agreed upon before we had the pandemic, when they were talking about how should we deal with the pandemic. But then after China started with a very radical and authoritarian shutdown, it seemed like there was not herd immunity, but a herd mentality, and every country just followed in their footsteps, even liberal democracies in the West. Sweden stuck to its guns, or well, the lack of guns, because there weren't many restrictions, few government restrictions. We stopped public events with more than 50 people, stopped visits to nursing homes. But apart from that, it was mostly a recommendation of social distancing, trying to trust Swedish citizens to uphold social distancing. Don't go to work if you can avoid it. Don't use public transportation if you can avoid it. Don't meet, especially not elder relatives and so on, which meant that there was lots of social distancing in Sweden, even though it left some room for individual needs and local knowledge, which I think makes this more sustainable than a radical lockdown. Lots of people said that Sweden was engaging in a crazy experiment, but in fact, to us Swedes, it looked like the rest of the world was engaging in a crazy experiment, because the world has never shut down like it did during this pandemic. And well, the result in Sweden so far, I guess we have it from New York Times today with a big headline: vilified early over lax virus strategy, Sweden seems to have scourge controlled. Because the early models said that Sweden would by now have some 100,000 deaths from the coronavirus. They only had it wrong by around 94,000 people. The model said that 30 to 40 people would fight over every hospital bed. But in fact, we maintained an excess capacity in intensive care units by around 20% all this time. We built a big new field hospital in Stockholm with room for hundreds of COVID-19 patients. That was never taken into use because the normal healthcare system could deal with the cases, and it is now being dismantled. So it seems like at least the horror version of what would happen in Sweden, that never took place.
Johan, very quickly, and Dave, you can jump in on this too. Here in the United States, everything is all about the mask now. You have to wear the mask. The masks are very protective, and we want to get Dr. Mercola's views on the mask as well, because that seems to be the most public perspective, that if you're wearing a mask, you're protecting yourself. My understanding is hardly anybody wears a mask in Sweden. So do you guys not understand the science? What is your problem?
Well, no, there are no legal mandate. And in fact, from the Public Health Authority, they say that the science is not clear when it comes to masks, because if you use them in the wrong way, it might even make things worse. And it's also something that might tempt you to be too close to people and avoid social distancing if you wear masks. So it is not happening in Sweden. We have rarely used it historically, so it's not really the Swedish culture, and it's not at least the Public Health Authority's take on science here.
So I think that brings us, unless Dave, you want to make a comment?
Mark, why don't we get Dr. Mercola in here, and then I'll share some thoughts after that.
Yeah, I think that would be great. So Dr. Mercola, please come in, because I know you've been a skeptic from day one on this pandemic. You're an outlier in some respects. I think the majority of scientists do think the pandemic is very serious, as Matt Ridley was saying. You need to require the mask. You've got to have a vaccine and so forth. So give us your perspective. What have you learned over the last 6 months about this disease, and is there a cure?
Absolutely. Well, my take is life is a learning journey, and I have great respect for what Sweden did. And even though they initially started the pandemic with an increase in death rates, most experts now, from my understanding, attribute this to their failure to address the issue in the elderly population. And if they had done that, they would have been spectacular. But to this day, the results are confirmed that they resisted deploying the strategies recommended by virtually the entire world population, and my kudos to them. In the United States, even prior to this year, there has been a progressive suppression in censorship of information that addresses the truth. This is done primarily through Google, which controls 92% of the searches in the world, and all the social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter, Instagram. They are suppressing any information that directly contradicts the narrative of the World Health Organization. And many on this video understand that organization is largely funded, the largest funder outside of the United States, which Trump wisely refused to fund, is now Bill Gates. So anything that conflicts with what they say is seriously suppressed and censored. And largely as a result of many, certainly largely urban areas that are democratically controlled and implemented these strategies, they're absolute miserable failures. So fortunately, we have some Republican governors. I live in the state of Florida. Governor DeSantis just earlier this week deployed a strategy very similar to Sweden. He stopped all the restrictions, no more social distancing, no more isolation, mask, and all the restaurants are open. So kudos to him, and I think we're going to, and we have not had an increase in cases. And there's this conflation of, once the deaths started going down, then because they're using fear to control the population. And so instead of using deaths, they switched it over to cases, making people believe that cases is a symptomatic infection when the true reality is not. Many of these tests are false positive. So what I've learned is that any information that conflicts with the narrative is suppressed. And one of the most important pieces of information is that we have the capacity to actually control this infection. In fact, the purpose of the vaccination program is to stimulate our own immune system, but very hardly anyone is discussing the simple strategies that we can do to activate our own immune system. And one of the ones that I've learned that is so important in this disease, and we've seen studies done specifically on vitamin D. There's one in Indonesia, and you can bring up the slide that shows that, where they had 212 patients, divided them into 4 equal groups, approximately equal groups. And the 2 most severe cases, the ones with severe and critical illness, 96% of that population with COVID-19 had low vitamin D levels. Where you go in the other side, and those with mild illness, 96% of that population had normal vitamin D levels. So that, I mean, you don't have to be a genius to understand that there's something to do with vitamin D. And the elderly and those with black skin are more susceptible to this because they're unable to literally go outside. And if they can go outside, they're not going to be able to get enough vitamin D. If you go to the next slide, understanding this, I put together a site that anyone can go to. It's called stopcovidcold.com. You don't have to submit an email or anything, and it can show you how to assess what your risk factor is for this disease. Simple 2-minute questionnaire, and it gives you the information, and there's reports that you can download that will supply you with easy to understand information that literally, because we don't have enough time to go into specific details there, but it's a simple strategy. And there are many others like insulin resistance and metabolic ill health or metabolic inflexibility, where our body, one of the common symptoms of that would be obesity. But what's common to obesity and diabetes and the other comorbidities like hypertension is that they are resistant to the hormone insulin. And when you are resistant to insulin, you have a massive overall suppression of your immune function. So just getting your immune function together and vitamin D levels will do enormous levels to improve your health and resist.
You mentioned obesity, and I think that's an important issue because we have an obesity epidemic here in the United States. But not in Europe. I mean, you go to the UK, you go to Sweden and so on, people are thin, right? They go to France, people are thin. Could that be, Johan is shaking his head. He's not, wait a minute, UK, I don't know. Maybe I misinterpreted that issue, but people who have comorbidity, this is an issue as to why they're suffering. Why don't we focus on healthy living rather than, we have everyone sequestered at home. The people are gaining weight. They're getting depressed. Maybe we have the wrong formula. Dave, you probably need make some comments or ask some questions.
Yeah, well, look, I'm out here in SoCal where everybody looks great and there's plenty of sunshine, so they're getting vitamin D and everyone looks healthy, and yet we're all walking around in masks all day. But Dr. Mercola actually hit on two things that I thought was interesting there. One, this is just anecdotal, but I have a friend whose girlfriend is a nurse here in California, and she said that at the hospital she's at, when you talk about the case numbers, that actually if someone comes in with COVID, they recount that case as COVID every day that they're at the hospital. So if you come in on day one and they diagnose you with COVID, that counts as one case. If you're there for 5 days, you're recounted as a new case every day. So that shows you that the numbers are a little screwy. And then what you
Johan
mentioned sort of about
make a comment on that.
All right, let me just say one other thing, and then we'll throw it to Johan, because this is related to the numbers as well, which is that when we talk about, trusting the CDC or trusting the WHO or the rest of it, this brings us to something that's very dear to me, and I think for probably most of the people watching this, which is just also how much power big tech has over us, and what information can be shared and is considered to be trusted and what isn't. But Johan, let's throw it to you.
Yeah, this is an incredibly important reason why we should be a little bit cautious about trying to compare cases and deaths around the world, because we don't have a standardized definition. For example, in Sweden, if you have or likely had COVID-19 and then you die within a 30-day period, you are counted as a COVID-19 death, even though you might have died from cancer or a heart attack or even run over by a truck. Whereas, so you count those who die with COVID-19 rather than those who died of COVID-19. Whereas in, for example, a very culturally and geographically similar country like Norway, they have great statistics, but they only count something as a COVID-19 death if a doctor looks at this person and concludes that COVID-19 killed him. And then he reports this to the authorities as a COVID-19 death. So I think we should wait a long time and look at excess deaths generally in countries before we begin to conclude who had a success or a fiasco over here.
Matt, you had a comment.
Yeah, I particularly just wanted to say one more thing about Sweden, which I think will interest Johan, which is that the British media has gone from saying out loud and very hysterically, Sweden is heading for a catastrophe, there's going to be millions dead in the streets and so on, to saying, no, the reason Sweden is doing better than us is because it's a different country. Their system wouldn't work here. They all live in huts in the forest, blah, 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 etc. This is ridiculous. Sweden is a more urbanized country than the UK is, actually. And its total population density is roughly the same as Scotland's, which has a bad epidemic. So the idea, the way the media has pivoted from saying Sweden's not going to work to saying Sweden has worked, but it's a special case, so we can ignore it, is really, really quite striking. Just on the point that you were just making, Johan, about deaths and deaths from other causes, there is good evidence now, certainly in the UK, that there is a pretty bad epidemic of mental illness coming about as a result of this problem. And it's worse among the young people than the old. Well, this is the very group that is not suffering very badly from the COVID virus. It's not being caused by the virus, it's being caused by the lockdown. So it is very probable that in terms of suicides and other things, that we will have a terrible epidemic among young people of increased problems that will dwarf anything that the virus does. So we do have to find a way to keep old people safe from this virus, because it isn't a safe virus for older people with comorbidities. And at the same time, allow normal life to resume for younger people, because it's a catastrophe what we're doing to our economy. I believe Sweden is still running a surplus. We're not. We're running a £300 billion deficit this year.
Wow. Yeah,
let's throw it to Dr. Mercola.
Yeah, just to highlight that point, less than 2 weeks ago, the CDC in the United States admitted that only 6% of the deaths from, and that's an important preposition, from, because that's what the media uses. They said died, 200,000 people in the US died from. No, 200,000 people died with COVID-19. The CDC acknowledges that only 6% of those died from it. So 94% did not die from the virus. They died from these confounding comorbidities, admitted by the CDC.
Right. So that's about 12,000 people.
How long is this? How long is this lockdown going to continue? It sounds like, from your own perspective, it's a mistake to engage in this lockdown. I understand that it's gotten worse in the UK. In terms of the lockdown. So when are we going to be able to have FreedomFest and have the doors opened, and are we going to be even physically able to gather together a couple thousand people in Las Vegas next July? Or if it's in the UK, we could all move to Sweden. We could have FreedomFest in Stockholm and we'd be fine, right?
Good idea. I mean, here in the northeast of England, we're under a renewed lockdown. We're now not allowed to socialize in each other's homes at all. And we're not allowed to meet in the pub with people from other households. And if we do go to the pub all on our own, we have to be out by 10 o'clock. And all of these laws are going through. We had a big debate in Parliament about this at the beginning of the week. They're going through based on an act that was passed 6 months ago that enabled the government to do anything it likes, basically to lock people up and not to have to come back to Parliament to get permission to bring in these new rules and laws. And we had a protest vote against that in the House of Lords, saying, come on, you've got to come back to Parliament and get approval to do these illiberal things that we're doing to our society, because it isn't working very well. It's very dangerous from the point of view of the economics, and it's terrifying what it's doing to society and to the desire for people to control each other's lives. Yeah. What really worries me is that once government gets hold of these kind of powers, it doesn't like to give them up too easily.
Yeah, well, I see we all nodded our head in agreement on that one, because that really gets to the heart of the reason why FreedomFest exists and why we care about these ideas. That's totally where I'm worried about. Look, I'm not a scientist, so I can track the information and listen to experts like you guys. But that part, the idea that, I can't make a decision as an adult over who is going to enter my home. Now, I'm in Los Angeles. We've got a pretty intense lockdown. You are allowed to have people in your home. It sounds like it is worse, at least at the moment, in terms of regulation in the UK. But the fact that we've allowed the government to say these are powers that we have over you, that's where you get all of my bells as somebody that cares about personal freedom. You get all those bells going.
And Dave, I would also add that in the United States, we have a written constitution, and in it, the Bill of Rights clearly says that Congress can make no law to abridge the freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and notice all of those have been abridged, just carte blanche, and our church leaders, our religious leaders, our local leaders, our universities, we've all just laid down and said, oh, okay, we won't go to church. We won't go to university. We won't go we'll do everything online. Unfortunately, technology has hurt us in this respect because let's face it, you wouldn't have closed down the schools. You wouldn't have closed down the churches. You wouldn't have done any of this, except that now we can do everything online. We can do the Zoom meeting. Zoom stock has gone through the roof. So Wall Street people are delighted with what's happening, and yet something is missing. It's called privileges, rights, freedom, liberty. Those have all been abridged. And, what do you do in countries, you're in Sweden. Do you have rights? Do you have privileges? Apparently you do.
Yeah, we didn't throw them overboard the moment we were in a crisis. But unfortunately, this fits with a historical pattern. H.L. Mencken's old saying, the goal of the demagogue is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous for safety. And I actually just published this book, Open, the Story of Human Progress, and it's got a very nice endorsement from Matt Ridley, so it must be good. And there I point to all the crises in history, the depressions, the pandemics, the natural disasters, what have you. It always creates this kind of societal fight or flight instinct when we want to be protected by the big man, the big government. And there are two major problems with this. The first one is that you never think of the alternative cost because, yes, this might be the way. A shutdown might at least delay many of the cases and deaths, but it doesn't take into the calculation all the things that should have happened and don't now. People don't go to hospital. They don't go to cancer screening. We don't get vaccinations around the world. In poor countries, we will see probably an increase in extreme poverty by somewhere around 100 to 300 million people. Another 100 million people thrown into chronic undernourishment because of a lack of transportation, trade, production, the things that we need. That's also a dramatic cost. The other thing is that once governments assume powers like this, it rarely gives them back, at least not in its entirety. There's a ratchet effect. They keep much of it. And what worries me is that historically speaking, this has been very bad. Lots of cases and deaths, and it's terrible, shouldn't be made light of. But historically speaking, it was a relatively mild pandemic. We'll get worse pandemics in the future. We'll see worse crises in other forms in the future as well. If we're so willing to throw all our liberties overboard once we get this, what are we willing to do the next time around?
Johan, show us your book again. What's it called? Open. And it's a very
The Story of
book.
Human Progress.
It kind of surprises me that your book is so thick because I would think that this should be one of those thin books in history. And so your sequel would probably be called Closed, and that'll be a very thick book, even thicker than that one. I really hope that that book, Open, we get back to that because I'm sure your book was written before the pandemic began, right?
Actually, the second half of the book is called Closed, about all the closures historically, including in times of pandemics. And I even managed to include some of the updates.
One of the
let
weird
me ask
things...
Matt, you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one of the things that I've noticed in this country, and I don't know if it's true elsewhere, is that the people on public salaries are quite happy to remain locked down because they can stay at home and draw their full salaries. And they don't see what the problem is. In fact, they're quite enjoying it to some extent. And there's a real double standard here that people in the private sector are really worried about their jobs. Government is trying to help them, but not for long. And there are job losses occurring on a massive scale. Whereas civil servants, officials in central government are saying, well, no, we'll just stay at home and do the odd Zoom meeting and take the dog for a walk. That really worries me, is that the difference between the way you're treated if you're in one sector versus another.
I feel that very intimately here in Los Angeles because, we've got a progressive big government governor in Gavin Newsom, who was the former mayor of San Francisco, and we know that it didn't quite work out there. And then we've got a progressive mayor here in Eric Garcetti. And then, of course, we've also got Nancy Pelosi, from California, and she's having ice cream and getting her hair cut. And, I can walk to several restaurants that, are within a mile of my house and they're all closed and they're small businesses, or the best they can do is put 2 or 4 tables outside. And of course, that's not sustainable. And you'd think that if these people are true public servants, that they would be out there every single day explaining why we have to, in effect, ruin your livelihoods. And yet they don't. It's just that every few weeks, they just give us a new edict of how we have to behave.
Well, it looks like we've run out of time, but I would like to have Dr. Mercola talk, end this by saying, well, what about medical scientists? We started with Neil Ferguson in the UK, Dr. Fauci in the US. Both of them still seem to be alarmists. Nothing has changed. They want the lockdown to continue indefinitely. Why? What is in the self-interest of the medical profession to want to solve this problem right away? I mean, they are pro-vaccine, but it does seem like it's taking forever for this vaccine. And I'm not sure the vaccine solves the problem. Solves the symptoms maybe, but not the problem.
Well, vaccine in no way is going to solve the problem because normally it takes about 9 years or so to put it through the rigorous trials to exclude any side effects. And this one is going to, at a fraction of that time. So it's inevitable to be a disaster, just like the swine flu vaccine in 1977 that preceded this, which literally had to be stopped after it was encouraged by the government and $3 billion was awarded. But what most physicians, if they're going into health care to help people, their true desire is to literally support them. Unfortunately, they're no different than anyone else, and they've been brainwashed, manipulated. The whole narrative in medical school, and I know because I went, is directed at literally suppressing these types of natural therapies that have been used for ages. That anything that conflicts with the pharmaceutical paradigm is suppressed. So, and that was done in 1910 by the Carnegie report that literally kicked out these natural therapies like homeopathy and other strategies. So it's difficult for them to get anything other than the main narrative. And they're so busy taking care of their patients and other things, they don't have time to explore these details in the amount of time they need to gain the understanding and proper perspective and the wisdom. So, but ultimately we want to preserve that. And interestingly, Dr. Fauci had mentioned reluctantly capitulated that even he takes vitamin D. So again, that stopcovidcold.com gives you all the information. It's free. There's no email sign up, stopcovidcold.com. So you can get these more information of what you can do to protect yourself, your families, and your loved one from this illness.
Great. Well, we want to thank you guys for joining us.